Time now to turn to Matt Taibbi, author of The Divide, American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap. Matt, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me on, Max.
All right, it seems to me like you had the financial scandals, which created enormous dislocations in society, and now we're seeing the result of what happens when you rip a lot of people off in places like Ferguson, right?
Right, no, absolutely, yeah. You know, I've been writing about this for years. In a way, you know, poor black communities, places like Ferguson they were the marks in the con and the entire subprime mortgage scam. And a lot of people don't realize how this worked. I mean, going back, you know, to the Bush years when they started talking about the ownership society, it wasn't like banks were doing this for altruistic reasons. This was all about money. And what they were really doing is they were creating millions and millions of subprime loans, and then they were mismarking them essentially and selling them off to sucker investors around the world, hedge funds, pension funds, foreign trade unions. But the whole thing depended upon creating millions and millions of loans, and somebody had to sign their names on the dotted line. And
so let me jump in here for a second. So you're going back to the whole Bush ownership society years, and that was the idea, and you got elected on this, and this idea that we're going to give everyone to buy a house in America through this magic of subprime.
Right.
And then through your books and your articles, you know that those subprimes are repackaged, shops like Goldman Sachs sold off to pension funds, and they made bets against their own customers.
Of course.
They broke the law 5 ways to Sunday, and now, you know, jump forward, it seems that this was not a random example of violence coming out of nowhere, is it?
No.
I mean, this is what's going on in Ferguson is the predictable result of what happens when you disenfranchise people, right?
No, absolutely. Look, these people were disenfranchised in several different ways throughout this process. Number one, again, they were sort of incidental victims of the larger scam of we just need somebody to sign all these loans, and who better to do it? We'll just fan into these neighborhoods and get a whole bunch of people to take free loans. You know, it's sort of like those crime movies, you know, where the drug dealers hand out free turkeys on Thanksgiving. They were going into these neighborhoods and saying, look, do you want a free house, basically?
Nicky Barnes, American Gangster, comes to mind.
Exactly, it's American Gangster. They would knock on the door and say, look, do you want an interest-only loan? You won't have to pay anything for 2 years. Here you can get a refi. You know, you've been living in this house for years. You can take some cash out of your house. And it sounded all very altruistic, but in reality, what were they doing? They were just creating lots of paper that they could chop up, turn into collateralized debt obligations, you know, the investment banks, and then they would resell it somewhere else where some sucker would buy it. So that happened. So these people got into a lot of bad loans. That was one negative consequence of it. Then when the markets collapsed, a lot of these people were foreclosed upon with essentially bogus paperwork. And so you had this mass perjury effort where you had robo-signing scandals where all of the biggest banks in the world were essentially creating chains of title and other legal documents, you know, out of whole cloth. They were just inventing them. They were committing frauds upon the court in every community, everywhere in America. And there's been no criminal penalty for any of that. They just wrote a check to make that go away.
Right. Now, Matt, I want to, in other words, what we're saying here is that people are focusing on this one event, Ferguson, Missouri. There's a spontaneous eruption of violence. People are down there, journalists are getting beat up. But this is a symptom of a much bigger problem. And I think what you've been writing about in your books and your stories has been attacking really the center of this problem, is that the culture in the big money center banks and on the Goldman Sachs and the JP Morgans is thoroughly corrupt. And when you allow, if there's no attempt to rail that in, there's no penalties, and it just grows, it ends up undermining the society at large. Now, the book, The Divide, it really attacks how this is spreading out all over America, right?
Well, sure, and people see the dichotomy. I mean, think about it. If you had a militarized police presence swarming lower Manhattan and all the places where the capital markets were operating, if every investment banker in the country had to be stopped every 10 minutes on his way to work and have his briefcase inspected, they would revolt in a second. Of course there would be violence. They'd be like, take it somewhere else, Buster, with all this stuff, right? But in reality, they're only doing that in urban centers where you know, they have an incredible police presence in all these places, and it's extremely minor crimes that are being policed so heavily. But meanwhile, these incredibly consequential national and international scams are going totally unpunished, and that even if people don't know the specifics of why that's happening, they can still feel it. People in these cities know that people like Jamie Dimon and other investment bankers are getting away with no penalties whatsoever, or they're writing a check to make it go away. And meanwhile, they're doing hard years for little tiny crimes. Of course they're going to be angry, right? I mean, isn't that just sensible?
They now, the cat's out of the bag. They see that these guys are getting away with massive fraud, and they're being prosecuted. It's like Les Miserables. Somebody steals a cigarette,
right,
and suddenly
and you're getting shot for it.
They're getting shot.
Right.
But I want to dig down into something, pick your brain a little bit, because you've been covering the crime on Wall Street now, a Wall Street crime reporter for a number of years. So you've got an appreciation for how these things work. The cost of these militarized police forces in these towns is enormous.
Of course.
So I can just imagine that the way that they're going to pay for all this is they're going to bundle all this up as a terrorist prevention bond.
Right.
You see, like all this, Ferguson's got all this equipment suddenly. Who paid for all that?
Right.
Well, they probably lent them the money.
Right.
And then they're going to repack all those loans into
swap it out.
Swap it out, right?
Right.
So just like, I know this is kind of freestyling a bit, but am I touching on a chord here? Can you kind of riff on this?
No, of course. I mean, think about it in terms of like Jefferson County, Alabama. Like what happened there? The town's ordered by the federal government to build a new sewer system. They design one for $250 million. Local graft turns it into a $3 billion project. They can't pay for it. But no worries. Wall Street comes to the rescue and says, look, we'll create all these financial instruments. You can swap out this debt. You can pay for it 10 years down the road. And nobody understood what they were getting into. In some cases, they bribed local officials to sign on the dotted line. And 10 years down the road, the bill comes due and they can't pay for it, and they're in bankruptcy for a generation. I am sure that is happening with a lot of these military.
Right, so here you are in Ferguson, Missouri. Some salesman shows up and says, you know what? For a layaway plan, we're going to give you a militarized police force.
Right.
You know, you may never need it.
Right.
They do it in thousands of towns across America.
Right.
Then somebody steals a cigarette in some store somewhere,
right.
and suddenly, boom, martial law, and you got to use the stuff you got in the warehouse, and they escalate the problem.
Right.
Isn't this escalating the problem instead of doing what a police force is supposed to do, and it's damping down the problem?
Right. No, of course. I mean, if you're some kid and you live in a poor neighborhood and you come out of a store and you got a tank bearing down on you because maybe you lifted a cigarette out of a convenience store, of course that's escalating the problem. I mean, that is the whole point of the discrepancy here. People don't understand. It's all about allocation of resources and allocation of law enforcement resources. How many people do you think they have policing the capital markets here down on Wall Street? How many agents do you think they have covering it? Do they have any special equipment that they're using to surveil that particular part of the American economy? Of course not. But in every little town in America, every place where poor non-white people live, you have the most expensive military equipment known to man, and somebody's paying for that, and people can't not notice that dichotomy.
What about you see now, these images are coming out of places like Ferguson. They look a lot like what we see overseas.
Yeah.
You know, uprisings in countries around the world, and America looks at these countries and go, oh, you know, glad thing didn't happen here, but suddenly this stuff is happening here, especially since 9/11.
Right.
You know, seeing a globalization of this type of confrontation between rich and poor. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think most people who lived in the real hot zones in a lot of American cities would say that it's very much like living in an occupied territory. I mean, I did a story about Camden, New Jersey, where they've been fighting over territory in a way that's very similar to our military campaigns overseas. I mean, they essentially had to cede a whole bunch of territory a couple of years ago when there was a budget crunch and the police had to step back, and now they're kind of reclaiming territory in a way that's very military. I mean, it's not the fault of the police necessarily. It's just very much like occupying a foreign territory.
Right. Let's get into a couple of the names that most often hear when we talk with Matt Taibbi. So last year, Jamie Dimon, he met up with Eric Holder. They agreed to pay $13 billion on matters relating to mortgages-backed security fraud. No jail time, no public disclosure of what the evidence was even.
Right.
And still Jamie Dimon, here's another part of this question. He's held up as a hero.
Right.
So here you have no jail time, no disclosure, and he's a hero. talk a little bit.
Well, first of all, they were Eric Holder, the Attorney General. They were set to have a press conference announcing a major civil action against J.P. Morgan Chase about a year ago. I think it was September 24th of last year. And hours before that press conference, Jamie Dimon personally calls like Holder's number 2 deputy, I think it was, and they instantly renegotiate the whole thing, and the press conference is put off, and next thing you know, there's a $13 billion settlement where the whole thing goes away, and there were no criminal charges. Can you imagine any other person who would be the target of a federal investigation being able to call up the Attorney General or call up the prosecutor in charge of the case and say, let's talk this over, let's make this go away? An ordinary person just cannot do that, and that happens over and over again in these cases, that these things are decided at a level that are not available to the ordinary criminal defendant or the ordinary target of a federal investigation.
Are we heading to a flashpoint? Because Voltaire said, injustice in the end produces independence. So if the growing wealth gap is causing more injustice, will independence eventually result? See where I'm going with this? In other words, is this leading to a point where the American character says, basta, says
right.
enough is enough?
Enough with this, right?
What's your sense?
I mean, when Ferguson first happened, I mean, I've wondered why this hasn't happened before. I mean, I think if you go to any inner city in America, there's enough rage and dissatisfaction, and a lot of it is also just simple economic pressure that people have been put under. And it's not just in non-white neighborhoods; it's in the suburbs where people have been disenfranchised. Also, they've lost their jobs. There's a tremendous amount of anger out there. It's inarticulate anger for the most part. People don't know exactly why they've been put in the position they've been put in.
I give you the point. I grew up in Westchester, not far from here, a nice town, Larchmont. And I'm in New York, I meet up with people I've known for 30 years, going back a long time. And they tell me these are people at the country club sorts.
Right.
They're getting the pressure. They're feeling, they got to give it up, man. They're getting economically squeezed. Now, going back to the American Revolution, it was the middle class that staged the revolution. It wasn't the worst affected.
Right.
It was the guy in the upper middle class who had some taken away.
Sure.
And suddenly said, you know what, the hell with this, I'm revolting. Do you get the sense of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think anybody who's middle class in this country or formerly middle class in this country would tell you that the people have been put under enormous pressure. I mean, real incomes haven't risen for God knows how long, and then of course you compare that with people at the very top who are continually increasing their share of the pie, and that just raises the level of dissatisfaction and anger, and eventually it just, the center will not hold, things fall apart. Isn't that the line, right? I mean,
exactly.
This just cannot hold. It has to fall apart.
All right,
eventually.
finally, we got about 30 seconds left. You are now at First Look Media. And of course, we follow your movements quite closely, and there's an unnamed project coming down I would be, you wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask you, can you tell us any more about this?
Yeah, no, it's going to be a humor, satire magazine, but with some biting investigative journalism too. I think we're just sort of going to be anything that's phony and corrupt and dysfunctional about this country. We're going to hit it, and we got a really great team.
And hit it hard!
And hit it hard, we got
Matt, we're out of time.
Team.
Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
All right, thanks a lot, Max. Take care.